Welcome to Praxis, a podcast where we explore how to practice and embody the way of Jesus in our everyday lives. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen. Today, we're going to jump into a brand new series on emotional intelligence. Dallas Willard once said, quote, "Jesus is the smartest man who has ever lived." And we believe that to be true, including when it comes to emotional intelligence. We believe that Jesus had more EQ than any other person that has ever walked the planet and consistently embodied emotional maturity. And so, if we're going to grow as disciples of Jesus, we must grow our emotional maturity. Growing in emotional maturity is an essential part of following Jesus and living as disciples. In this episode, we provide a basic introduction to emotional intelligence, what it is, why it matters, and how we can begin growing into it. And to help us get started and set the stage for the rest of this series, today we're joined by two very good friends and our first guests ever on Praxis, Trisha Taylor and Jim Herrington from The Leader's Journey. So we hope you enjoy this introduction and conversation with Jim and Trisha. Let's get into it.
Welcome, everyone, to Praxis. My name is Katie.
And I'm Mac.
So today we are jumping into a new series on emotional intelligence, or EQ. You've heard of the term IQ. This is the same concept, but for emotions. One of my very favorite authors, Dallas Willard, once said that Jesus is the smartest man who ever lived. And we believe that to be true. That Jesus is the smartest and most intelligent person that has ever lived, and part of this intelligence includes emotional intelligence. We believe that Jesus has more EQ than any other person that has ever walked the planet, and that he consistently walked with emotional maturity. And so if we're going to grow as disciples of Jesus, we must grow in our emotional maturity. In other words, growing in emotional maturity is an essential part of following Jesus and living as disciples. So in this episode, we want to provide a basic introduction to emotional intelligence, what it is, why it matters, and how we can begin growing into it.
Yeah, and to help get us started and set the stage for this series, we're joined today by two of my good friends, Trisha Taylor and Jim Herrington from The Leader's Journey. And by the way, you're our first guest ever on Praxis, so welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to take a moment just to introduce you to our listeners. I see the two of you sort of as partners in crime. You've co-founded The Leader's Journey together. For those of you that may not know, The Leader's Journey provides coaching and consulting, mostly in the nonprofit world, but not exclusively. But you help leaders and congregations and organizations increase their emotional maturity and intelligence. You've co-authored a couple books together, Learning Change and The Leader's Journey. I've read both of them, and they're both fantastic. And you each bring a lot of experience and expertise to the table. So Trisha has been a psychotherapist for more than 25 years. She's an ordained minister and has been a co-founder of Faith Walking, Missional Marriage, and Ritter Church Renewal. Trisha's married to her husband, Craig, who is also a pastor, and they have 2 adult children. And Jim has been a pastor for 45 years, which just means, Jim, you're really old.
For sure.
Yeah, but you...
And Baptist ordained really young.
Yes.
That's right.
Jim has served as a denominational executive. He's worked with hundreds of congregations. In 1998, he became the executive director of Mission Houston, a ministry that works to build unity in the body of Christ across lines that would normally divide. I love that. And then in 2007, he co-founded Faith Walking. Jim, you're married to Betty, and together you have 5 children and 6 grandchildren. And I've had the privilege of working pretty closely with the two of you over this last year at The Leader's Journey. So I know that the two of you are the real deal. You've significantly impacted my life and leadership, and I'm just incredibly grateful to have you join us today and share with our community. So Jim and Trisha, once again, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. We love working with you too.
Yep.
So, all right, in order to talk about EQ, we need to define it, right? This is a phrase that we might hear often, we might use, but what does it actually mean? And where did it come from? Can you guys start us out by speaking to that a little bit? What is emotional intelligence?
Yeah, I think it's a discipline of study that I think emerged as people started to realize that the idea of IQ really didn't cover all the different ways that we need to be able to see the world, and that intellect alone just wasn't descriptive enough about what it means to be human. And so there were a lot of people working on EQ before it was called that. But Daniel Goleman is the one that kind of took all of that research and gave it a name and said, this is the way we can think about how we need to see the world by looking at, are we aware of ourselves? Are we able to manage ourselves? And are we aware of the emotional lives of others? And are we able to, obviously we don't manage others, but can we understand and influence the emotions of others? And when you put those things on the table, then the idea of emotional intelligence starts to emerge.
So and it gives you like 4 categories to be able to think about. Well, like I know a lot of people who know their emotions and can manage themselves, but who, when you get into the social settings, I would have been one of those years ago I was clueless about how the way that I showed up had impact on the groups of people that I was hanging out with. And so it gives you it breaks it down into some parts that you can work on.
Yeah. And as I listened to you, I heard you name those 4 areas as self-awareness, self-regulation or self-leadership, social awareness, being aware of what others might be thinking or feeling, and then sort of managing your relationships. And, Trisha, you said something interesting. You said, obviously, we're not talking about managing others. Maybe that may not be so obvious to others. Just flesh that out a little bit. Why did you say that?
Well, because that's kind of the opposite, maybe, of emotional intelligence. That's the thing that we do when we're not being emotionally intelligent, is that we're assuming that everyone else is having the same experience that we are. So we lack awareness of others. And then we think that basically they're characters in our story and that we should be able to, manage what they do and don't do and how they feel and how they show up. And we do that in a whole variety of ways. We all have strategies that we use to try to control other people. And when we're doing that, although we may be really, really good at it, that's the opposite of emotional intelligence.
Yeah, that's a great clarifier. One thing I was noticing about myself this past week is that I've been using and I'm not sure this is right, so I'll punt this to you guys and interact with it. I've been using the phrase emotional intelligence and emotional maturity almost interchangeably. And I'm not sure that's the right, I guess as I've been thinking about the difference between the two, maybe emotional maturity is the application of emotional intelligence. What would you guys say about that? Those two terms.
I was just in Nashville this last week leading a 2-day conference for a group of people. And as our colleague Mike Dreiter and I were putting the PowerPoint together, I actually wrote to Trisha and said, these are not synonyms, right? She's the go-to person in all of this. The way I think about it, Mac, is that emotional intelligence is like a metric. And emotional maturity is like the set of practices. Like if I've got a low level of emotional intelligence, then the practices of emotional maturity are the way that I grow my emotional intelligence.
Yeah, that makes
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Yeah, that's a great clarifier.
Just because you know all this stuff doesn't mean you necessarily embody it well.
Right. Well, in fact, I think that's the educational model out there is, okay, I don't have emotional intelligence. And then what I'll do is I'll read a book about emotional intelligence, and somehow that's going to magically change who I am. But probably for all 4 of us, our life journey, for whatever level of emotional maturity we have, we've worked on that really in some really challenging contexts and in what some people call the messy middle from where you start to where you are. You made fun of me a while ago and called me an old guy, but it's a lifelong process. I'm 70 years old and I'm still this week I've had an experience where I've had to stop and think about all this, and where I'm doing some practice. It's a lifelong process.
I think too, the way we use the word emotional maturity is really rooted in Bowen theory and family systems theory, which is another way of seeing the world. I think there would be an enormous amount of overlap between how we use the phrase emotional maturity, how the business world and world of psychology uses the phrase emotional intelligence. But I would add that often the emotional intelligence work is very individualistic. This is what one person possesses, and this is what that one person can do to grow their capacity. When we talk about emotional maturity, we're rooting it in systems thinking. So we're looking at a lot of different forces, and it becomes much more complex. And we're looking at our place in systems and how we've been shaped by systems, how anxiety impacts us in those systems, and so forth. It just gets a lot more nuanced in my view.
Yep. Yeah. I could imagine someone might be listening in on this conversation going, why does this matter? Why does emotional maturity matter? And I wonder if you two could speak to that. I mean, you've given your life's work to helping organizations and, individuals and leaders grow into this. So why would you say it matters?
I want to answer your question. I do, because it matters to me a great deal. But you're the one who's doing a series on it. Mm-hmm. Why do y'all think it matters?
Good call, Trisha. Good call.
I see what you did there.
Because this is what he does on our podcast. So I thought it was only fair to
taste of his own medicine.
I do throw curveballs in there. I can tell you when it first started to matter for me. And that's when I realized I needed more of it. So the times when I realized, wow, I need a more emotional maturity were the moments when I was put in positions where I was like, oh man, I need more of something that I don't have. And as I reflect on it, Jim, you had mentioned, hey, some people have sort of the self-awareness and self-regulation, but then they lack the social pieces. I think that pretty much maps my own experience. I remember when I was first promoted to an executive pastor position, I was 29 years old. And I went from a peer on staff to now leading, formerly who were my peers, and they were all older than me. And I felt like immediately it was like baptism by fire. And I realized I was in over my head. And that's when I first went to a therapist and was just like, I need to talk through some things that I'm experiencing and grow in some ways. And that was my first introduction to Daniel Goleman and some of those key authors that have contributed to the conversation. But most of it was me working on myself. And then I think the second layer was the first time I tried to lead significant change in the context of a community. And I've shared this before, but I thought that some of the changes that I was spearheading would be welcomed with applause and pats on the back. And instead, I experienced lots of resistance and frustration. And that's when I realized, wow, there's social things happening here that I was not aware of. There were, as you were naming, Trisha, there's a system in play. People are reacting and bouncing off each other in ways that I didn't understand. And that's when I first kind of was introduced to Bowen family systems theory and began reading some of the key contributors there and realizing, man, if I'm going to survive as an individual and as a leader, I need to be attending to this.
Yeah, I might share.
Katie, what about you?
Yeah, I would share a similar experience actually early on in my professional role. I was an attorney for about a decade before coming to join the staff Crosspoint team. And I was put into a managerial role pretty early on in my career, where all of a sudden I had same thing. I had some supervisory authority over people who had been practicing law longer than I had been alive. And there were also kind of some difficult relational dynamics at play in this workplace. And so, I pretty quickly learned that I didn't necessarily have the most experience in the room. I may not have even had the most head knowledge of the subject matter, but I learned that it was really important for me in that time to have emotional maturity, and that even if I didn't have the most experience, that just by embodying and staying regulated, I I think I did gain some respect as a leader just by being able to embody that emotional maturity in difficult situations where other people had anxiety and were bouncing off of each other. But I was able to gain the respect I didn't do it perfectly, I'm sure, but by putting some of these things into practice.
Mac, your story reminds me of where I first learned this stuff, where I began learning this stuff. My first executive leadership role, about 2 years into the role, I got accused in a personal letter that went to 500 pastors in the city of Houston, accusing me of being a liar and a thief. And the copy of the letter was not sent to me. And that led to public hearings where all those charges had to be explored. And in a meeting with 275 pastors, where the results of the exploration had been done, I was found not guilty. But the guy who was moderating the meeting said, I was 37 years old. He said, when we hired Jim, we knew that he had a lot to learn. He was a young guy and he was going to have a lot to learn. And what I can see now that I could not see then was, looking back on the experience, they called me to lead change. And what I can see about myself, this is embarrassing, but it's true, was that I was on a mission. And if you wanted to go with me on the mission, you were my best friend. And if you didn't want to go with me on a mission, then you were an obstacle to be overcome. Bulldoze over you, shame you, judge you, make you feel guilty, do whatever you had to do to get you out of the way. And I just had no awareness of how my behavior was impacting other people. And then they were going out and talking to other people about the experience they had, who were going out, and then they're all getting together and saying, well, you think you did that to you? Let me tell you what he did to me. And it was a really humiliatingly painful experience, but it was a beginning place where I began to see something that I just hadn't been capable of seeing. And once you can see it, then it just opens up a whole world of stuff to you that without seeing it, you don't have access to. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. What about you, Trisha?
Yeah, I think I came in to adulthood out of, in a world where being smart was really highly valued. And, intellect and knowing right answers and having information and, being able to present that information in an impressive way was what was valued. And then getting into the real world and finding out that that's not really how the real world works. And that all the information in the world couldn't help me to be the person I wanted to be, especially under pressure, and really didn't have what I needed to be able to also to help other people, to help leaders, to help people in my therapy office who were up against really big challenges. And just, being able to have concepts just was not going to do it for any of us. And so I think that, and recognizing that although I came out of a spiritual tradition that really basically said following Jesus was about your behavior, and then I got attracted. I guess there were other parts of our spiritual tradition that said that spiritual maturity was about, knowing all the right answers. Like Jim says sometimes, he who knows the most verses wins. Although in my case, it was always me. I always knew the most verses everywhere.
It's just because we weren't in the same church.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And so then to realize that actually living the way of Jesus wasn't really about either of those things. It was about that deep inner emotional life and the relational life and how those two things come together. And that was a mind-blowing experience for me.
Well, and the thing that stirs in me is in our book, The Leader's Journey, if it's not the first sentence, it's the first paragraph. We ask the question, have you ever known the right thing to do, but been unable to do the right thing? And of course, everybody answers the question, yes, like we do. And what we recognize is that so often what happens is I know the right thing to do. I attempt to do the right thing, but there's a lot of emotion that gets stirred up in that. And at some point, I lose my capacity to think, and I'm just reactively trying to protect or defend myself. One of my first coaches said to me one day, you know the verse about if your brother or sister offends you, you go work it out with them. You know that in 3 translations because you're a Baptist guy who values the word.
Yeah.
And he said, but what I have come to believe about you based on the things you've revealed to me is that though you know that verse, you've never practiced that verse. It was like, wait a minute. And so what he did was he actually, that came out of a conversation where somebody had offended me. And he said, let's work on you going and working that out. And so after some coaching, I did. And I wish that I could tell you that it went well, but actually it was an ugly mess. I got defensive. He got defensive. I went back to my coach and said, I don't know whose idea it was to go practice this, but that was a bad idea. What I wish I could say is that he sent me back, and he did send me back a second time. And on the second time it went well. Actually, what happened was it took me 4 times of going to this person, trying to work it out. The conversation goes badly. Emotions get stirred up. We say things we don't mean, or we don't say things we wish we had said. I go back to a coach where I reflect on the experience. He helps me think through that. Where did I get triggered? What could I have said differently? I go back. It took 4 times to get that worked out. Now, what I couldn't see that in the moment, but what I can see now is almost all of the practices that Jesus calls us to have an emotional component to them. And if you can't regulate your own emotions and have some sense of how your behavior is impacting the other, then at some point along the way, the emotional intensity is gonna shut the process down, and you're going to go back to where I was saying, maybe just believing the Bible is better than, than trying to practice what it teaches.
Well, and the idea was, if there were gaps like that where you didn't live into what Jesus taught, or the fruit of the Spirit, or whatever, then you were rebellious against God and you needed to repent. And in our tradition, you would go down front and tell the pastor how you were, at the end of the worship service, tell the pastor how you're falling short and make a promise to do better. And emotions were, I think I was taught sometimes explicitly that emotions were just pesky obstacles to that whole process. And I have come to believe that they're God-given. Even the ones we call negative emotions are God-given. And when we learn how to see them and recognize them and name them and see them in other people and manage them and regulate ourselves around them and so forth, that's where all the magic is. And that's where the maturity really happens.
Yeah. I started by saying, why does this matter? And maybe I could summarize what I hear you saying by, I hear you guys saying that it's actually essential to following Jesus. You grew up in traditions where it was just about having the right head knowledge or the right answers or having the right behavior. But there was this piece of being that's central to our personhood, right? That needs to be spiritually transformed by the Spirit and often needs the input and community of others to help us get there. That's why this matters. It matters because as followers of Jesus, we need to grow our capacity here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And go ahead, Katie.
Go ahead, Jim.
Well, I was just going to finish the thought that I had when Trisha was talking about going down front, doing all that stuff. Generally, what happened then, not only we taught that emotions were these pesky things, but I was taught that the solution to whatever it was you were down there confessing was read your Bible more, memorize more verses, and pray more. And I'm not saying that any of those things, I think all those things are good things, but they're not enough until we actually get out there and practice self-regulation and all the things that go with emotional intelligence. Then it's going to be hard to make progress. And I think that's part of the reason that the Christian faith and our current culture takes so much. We take so many hits from the unchurched world. Yeah, is that they see us and they say, the practices, but you don't practice the practices.
Yeah. So I hear you saying it can be tempting or natural for us to think of the spiritual world as one world and maybe the world of emotional intelligence as another world, and maybe in the mental health space. But I hear you both pointing to Jesus as an example of embodying emotional intelligence and having how this work is really essential for our discipleship. So do you have any examples that you could give us about the ways that you are learning from Jesus how to do this well? Like, how did you see him embody doing this work?
One of the fun things that we do when we're leading groups is we ask that question. That we'll ask them to like get in pairs or around their table and ask them where they can see that showing up in the life of Jesus. And so, I think we both have a long list.
Early on, when we took on the emotional maturity work, which is the basis for our book, The Leader's Journey, I sat down with the Gospels and just read through the Gospels, only asking myself the question, does this ring true in the life of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus? And that was part of the mind-blowing experience for me. And I will say, our colleague and co-author, Robert Creech, did an amazing amount of work on this, and we can give you a link to put in your show notes where people can just go see a really beautiful description of Jesus in this work. But for me, I had to go find out for myself. And so it was reading through the scriptures and seeing how well Jesus knew himself, how he really, from the time he's 12 years old, he has a really deep sense of who he is, what the Father has given him to do, what his mission is. I don't think he knew all the details. I think he figured out a lot of those as he went along. I don't think he was born with a 30-year plan, but I do think that he came into adulthood through maybe the testing in the desert time, with a really clear sense of who he was. And he really couldn't be swayed up by that. People put enormous pressure on him all the way to the point of death, right? But lots of other kinds of pressure that we all experience. And he just doesn't waver. And yet, at the same time, he is really deeply connected to a whole lot of different people. I mean, pretty much everyone in his culture, we have some story about him being deeply connected to them. Sometimes when they are coming at him as adversaries, and sometimes when they are coming to him to co-opt him or to manipulate him. And we just see Jesus in really masterful ways, both holding on to who he is and what he knows about himself and his mission, and relating to people really wisely, and with a full range of emotion. I mean, I'm so grateful that Scripture gives us a sense of some of the emotions of Jesus. I wish there was more. Obviously, I would like to see more, but it gives us enough to know they experienced the full range of emotions and yet was able to, and at every turn, show up in a way that was consistent with who he was.
I've taught a class a few times for our community around this topic of emotional maturity in the way of Jesus. And that's one of the assignments is we take those 4 quadrants you talked about, self-awareness, and try to read through the Gospels, paying attention to each one. And you really do see Jesus being aware of his emotions and honoring those. You see Jesus being able to regulate and choose how he's going to show up, maybe because of or in spite of those emotions and thoughts. He's attuned to people. I mean, just think about all the moments where he sees someone in pain and suffering and he's moved with compassion because he can empathize with them, right? And he's able to manage himself in a whole lot of very complex social situations that I know I would crumble in, He doesn't cower when a trap is set or when there's pressure for him to turn back or to leave the area, right? He's resolute and focused. So I think there's as you were naming, Jim, you said this is a lifelong process. I also think there's you'll never exhaust this. You'll never stop learning from Jesus, even though the words are there for us all the time. You can keep rereading these stories and these interactions and never sort of plumb the depths of their significance.
if we have time, there's two illustrations that I would use that are
go for it.
less global and real specific in my life. I grew up in a setting where what it meant to be a Christian was that you knew the truth and others didn't, and you judged those who didn't, and you did whatever you could do to get them to come to your view of things. About the time I was learning all of this, I was reading Michael Frost and Alan Hirsch's Read Jesus, which is a book that really impacted my life. And they helped me. So the Zacchaeus story would be a story. To really read the Zacchaeus story, you've got to ask the question, how would you show up with someone who sided with people who had invaded your country, taken over the power structures? You had seen them abuse people in your family and in your context, and then how are you going to relate to that person?
Yes.
And Jesus relates to him in a way that is so contradictory to anything that I would have ever even considered.
Yes.
And so because I would have been so scared or so angry or so, fill in the blank with whatever it is, that the thought of loving him would not even be entertainable. I wouldn't be able to get it to my consciousness. That's one story where I have increasingly tried to practice a life of loving my enemies, not in some theological or theoretical way, but and I've got a long way to go, but that's an example. I think the other example that's really central to my life is that pretty early in my young adulthood, I had a mentor named Larry Baker who helped me to see how Jesus related to women differently than the Southern Baptist culture that I grew up in, where women were second-class citizens and there was a complementarian kind of view. And he was very thoughtful in helping me do that. And it opened up for me this recognition that if I was going to live in the way of Jesus, I was going to treat women as equals. I was going to be an egalitarian. I didn't know those words back then. And what I can look back and see is that the pressure to not do that was mostly in the Southern Baptist system that I was in. And so at UBA, when I invited Diane Kidd to become the associate executive director of the largest Baptist association in the planet, I took all kinds of heat. And finally, they said to me, okay, if this is what you want to do, you're in charge. But if anything goes wrong, you're in charge. And it was like, we're not going to fight you on this. We think this is wrong. And so both of those are illustrations where the scripture taught me something that was different than what I had been taught, and where there was a lot of emotional energy both within me and outside of me that had to be practiced over time to show up in a different way.
Wow. I think that we share this assumption, but I'll name it as assumption in case you want to challenge it. I assume that we can grow in our emotional maturity. It's not like something that's fixed, like an IQ, but it's something we can grow into with practice, self-reflection, etc. But let's say our listeners they can identify with feeling in over their heads, man, I don't feel like I have what you guys are talking about. How would someone begin to grow in their emotional maturity?
I think Dallas Willard answers that question by saying, well, you start by intending to. You start by deciding that's something I'm going to take on. I love that part of his Divine Conspiracy where he says, in so many places, you don't have to be a disciple to be a good church member.
Yeah.
And you have to intend to do this work, would be where I would begin.
Maybe then a next step would be to do a little bit of research, to get some information, to get a sense of what it would look like, what a more emotionally mature stance in life looks like, or a more emotionally intelligent way of life, what that looks like, so that you can describe it, so you can see it in your imagination, so that when you see people who are, who have more capacity than you do, you know it when you see it and you can identify it. I think that just being able to name, to put some details in with that intention. I just worked with a coaching client just, an hour ago, right before we got on this call, where he just was working so hard to name how I want to show up when someone comes to me as a leader and they are very upset and they think it is my job to make them feel better. So he was that specific. And then he just started describing, almost like he was watching himself in a movie. He started describing how he would like to show up in situations like that, very specifically. And I think being able to get it into our imagination and see it, see the thing we intend, is a huge part of that. I would also add, Mac, I mean, you're exactly right. Whether we're talking about the research around emotional intelligence or the research around emotional maturity, the research is clear that we can actually grow our capacity and that we can grow it in life-changing ways. I mean, that is true. That's not just an assumption. I think that we can say that's been demonstrated.
I don't know if this was in Dallas Willard's Divine Conspiracy, but I remember the acronym VIM, Vision, Intention, Means. And I heard you, Jim, name intention. And Trisha, you're saying you need vision for this too. You might have to do some research to get an imagination for what emotional maturity looks like in all these different circumstances in your life. What are some things that in coaching people and walking with people and even for yourself, you would say is on the means part, some practical steps?
So I use the framework that Paul uses of taking off the old self and putting on the new self. And what I do is I work with folks to help them see when they get reactive, what they do. What I say, a little thing that I say to help them remember is you can't take off what you can't name and see. Paul says, take off the old self. Yep. So what are you trying to take off? And then I do what Trisha just described. I'll also say, not in some big theoretical, theological way, but in a very practical way, like when my wife, when I feel like my spouse is not listening to me, or when I feel like my boss is being unfair to me, like in a very specific context, if I was showing up as my best self, as my true self in Christ, like get really specific, what would I do and what would I say? What would I not do and what would I not say? And then for me, the third piece of that is practice. And in the practice, I think it's Thomas Dewey who was first, this was first attributed to, but he said we don't learn from experience, but we learn from reflection on our experience. And so I almost always try to end a conversation by saying, okay, here's your old self that you've described. Here's what you've said you want to do. Now go practice. And like the story I told, several paragraphs ago, it doesn't go well. It takes 3 or 4 times, but I come back and in reflection with a coach or a spiritual director or a counselor or a pastor, where I can reflect on what happened, I begin to see things about myself or about my circumstances that I haven't been able to see. And seeing them opens up something that, as long as they're invisible to you, you don't have you're blinded to something. And so naming the old self, getting a vision for the new self, and then practicing and reflecting on trying to close that gap would be a high level of how I would describe how you get that work done.
So one theme that I hear both of you speaking about this that I think is really important is that this work is about us, right? Like this work is about us. I think it's so easy when we get into difficult situations just to think like, okay, if the other person would just do this, that, and the other thing, and if I could change their mind. And let's be honest, the people who don't think they need this work can sometimes be the most difficult people to work with. And so do you ever have situations with clients that you're coaching who are able to name a problem, but maybe not seeing their own role in it, right? Because what I hear you saying is a first step, Jim, is going, I have to recognize how I'm showing up and what is myself, what is the part of myself that I need to take on, and how do you help walk them through that shift?
Well, that's just human nature, right? It's not just our coaches. I mean, it's us, our coachees. It's us too, right? I mean, I think that's why Jesus said, hey, pay attention to the log in your own eye before you go try to take a speck out of someone else's. I think there's always the tendency to want to put the emphasis on either what other people need to do or how they need to change, or what I need to be able to do or say better so that those people will change, right? Like a lot of times we start with a place of what do I need to do to get someone else to do something? That's mostly what people come to therapy for.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, honestly. And so, the ability to hone in on what is my contribution here, first of all, I think takes an absolutely shame-free environment.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I acknowledge my part here, and then that's going to be used against me, and I'm going to be shamed, or I'm going to be blamed for this, there's no way we will touch that. And that's where I think the grace that goes with our faith is so important, because it says it's all about learning. So I can acknowledge my part, because that's what helps me learn. That's what gives me access to the kind of deep change we're talking about. So that might be a little bit off the path, but I think that's absolutely important. And then I think just asking that question and sitting with it, almost everyone I've ever known, if they will just sit with that question, what is my part in this? They almost always come to be able to see it.
I like to ask the question. Well, first of all, I would say that the family systems view that we hold is fundamentally different than what your brain is designed to do, and what happens automatically when things are not working. The relationship, the context is not working. What we do is we look to find something to fix or someone to blame. And this, if you've ever tried to change anybody, you know how it takes a lot of authority that you have over somebody to get them to do that. But when I have a lot more control over changing me.
Yeah.
I think that the beginning place is to say, for me, is to say that the approach to this is an approach that says, I'm going to work on me. And I think because, at least in the tradition I grew up in, everything was about Bible knowledge, being able to quote verses, that sort of thing. The thing that I will regularly say to people is, what's your part? And I'm asking a really specific question, not in some global way, but with this circumstance that you're describing. What are you doing, or what are you not doing? What are you saying, or what are you not saying? Or how are you saying what you're saying?
Yeah.
And I will often use my wife and I as examples, because she is an Enneagram 9, if you know what that is, and I'm an Enneagram 8. And so for me, it's generally what I'm saying or how I'm saying. For her, it's generally what she's not saying, because and so both of us have had to make some adjustments as we've stayed married all these years, and so you can get clear about what's my contribution by thinking in some really specific ways like that.
Yeah, you two actually need a different set of practices to move towards emotional maturity if you're going to navigate those tense moments well, right? Exactly. Which is another, which is also a way of saying there is not a cookie cutter approach to this work. Yeah.
Right. We don't have a 3 or 6 or 9 box checklist that you can check the list off and then be done. It is a dynamic process that has a lot of messiness in it, and that requires a lot of reflection, where the Spirit can actually speak. In my experience, the Spirit speaks most powerfully in me when I have a sting, not shame. I want to distinguish those. Trisha and I had a conversation this week where she gave me some feedback that stung, and the Spirit has kept that alive in my thinking all week long.
Yeah,
and it's the work of the Spirit there that is where real progress gets made.
What's making me laugh right now is just this morning. Now, remember, I'm 58 years old. My mother is 80 years old. And just this morning, she and I were talking about something. And I said, well, basically, Mom, it just boils down to that I know what the right thing is for everybody to do, and nobody will get on board. And my mom, she didn't even miss a beat. She said, yeah, you've had that problem all your life.
That's great.
Leave it to our moms to tell us how it is.
Human nature. Yeah.
Yeah. And I've, in talking with you over an extended time, I've heard you emphasize in doing this work the importance of engaging your first formation, or the family you grew up in, because sometimes that's where some of our defaults, get embedded. And then this is something that you've shared numerous times already in this conversation, is we often need help from other people. Some of our best moments where we're invited to grow in emotional maturity comes with those stings or those trusted people that we know will give us honest feedback, but intend it for our good. And I know for me, I wouldn't be where I am in terms of emotional maturity without having a group of people that gave me regular, honest feedback about how they're experiencing me in a whole variety of settings.
We don't have time today to tell you all the stories where people have given me feedback that stung, but that was like, those are the places where my real growth has taken place.
Yeah. So you two have been practicing this a long time, and you've got a lot of wisdom to share. But I imagine that, even despite all of that, you can still maybe feel stuck at times. Are there ever times when you kind of feel, stuck, where you're not sure where to go, or even though you know the right thing to do, it's still not happening? And if so, what do you do to get unstuck?
I'll let Trisha take this one because I don't ever get stuck.
It never happens to you, right?
Just shaking his head like he doesn't have any idea.
Oh, man.
But, this is one place, Jim, where I know you'd probably get stuck, but you do always have that growth mindset. I remember asking you one time, do you ever just say to yourself, this is just the way I am. This is the best it's going to be. And you looked at me like you had no idea, like, why would anyone think that? And you said, no, I really don't. And I think the example there is that you just kind of keep coming back to it. I've never seen you just say, well, there's nothing I can do here. I'll just be stuck. I'll just sit down here in the middle of the road and be stuck.
I don't remember that conversation, but it sounds like something I would say. The thing that I think is that this side of heaven, we're going to continue to have moments where we get stuck. What I believe is that as you practice this work over time, two things happen. One is you get attuned to your stuckness a lot more quickly. Trisha and I were in a meeting, and this has been several years ago, where we were talking and something happened, and I held my hands up like this, and I said, I need to report to you that I'm feeling a lot of shame right now. And we paused, and we took about, 3 or 4 minutes. And I was able to, Trisha asked some good questions. I was able to say what had happened. We were able to work that out. I can look back and think that would have happened 5 years ago. And it might have been 3 months that every time I was around her, that shame would have been in the space of the conversation. And so I'm attuned to it a lot sooner, and I'm better at using the tools that have developed. Now, I still get stuck, but I don't stay stuck as long because I've worked so hard on this, and I've got some practices that I have pretty quick access to. And I think the other thing that I would say is that I've developed key relationships with people like Trisha who have permission to give me feedback, who have permission to say, you seem stuck, who have permission to say, is there something that I can do to help with all that? All of that, I think, is in the space of my thinking about that.
Yeah, so I hear you saying that increasing your awareness of when you're stuck helps you actually move through it. Whereas if you don't realize that you're stuck, then you actually probably stay stuck a lot longer.
And I'm saying there's some specific tools. There's 3 or 4 or 5 tools that, like, when I'm learning to play the piano and I can barely do the scales, but with practice over time, you can play a concerto. It just takes a lifetime of practice.
And I would add courage and vulnerability. I've seen you do this, Jim. I remember one time we were having a Zoom call and we got talking and you went late and you showed up late for your next meeting. And I kind of felt like it was my fault that I made you show up late. But you named your shame to the entire group. And I think that's part of the way we get unstuck. When I get stuck, I feel shame. That's when I start to should on myself. I should be further along. I shouldn't be struggling with this anymore. I should be beyond this. And a big part for me has been learning to identify and name that shame, and first just bring it to Jesus, knowing that His patience doesn't run out, and I can face my stuckness in His presence with compassionate curiosity and continue to learn and grow. But I've also noticed that when I begin to name my shame for other people, all sorts of things happen. Sometimes I get encouragement, I'm I'm being too hard on myself. Other times I find that they're able to say things or have insights that I didn't have, which then helps me get unstuck in the future. Sometimes they enter into that shame with me. I didn't know that they were feeling shame too. Like any number of things can happen. But it just occurred, I wanted to double click on that and say, man, identifying and naming shame seems really important for getting unstuck, and yet it requires courage and vulnerability to do that.
And what I would add to that is, like, I grew up in a culture of shame. And so for you to say that, and I'm one of your listeners, I would think, not me, I'm out of here, buddy. I got all the shame I need in my life.
Yep.
If you can just, like, if you've got 100 units of energy to invest in this and 95% of them are covered up in shame, if you can just take 5% of that energy to begin to unravel that shame, you don't have to go from 0 to 60 in one coaching call or one deal. It is learning to deal with that is a lifelong process as well.
Trisha, do you have anything to add about how to get unstuck?
For me, being stuck is almost always a failure of imagination. And I just have to go back into what does it look like to given that whatever is happening, what does it look like to show up as a more emotionally mature, a more emotionally intelligent self? And then, what's the practice? What's the next right step?
Yeah.
Right. And that's where all that courage you're talking about. I do want to point out that in that conversation about shame, you really worked the 4 quadrants of emotional intelligence, right? Mm-hmm. You said you learned to notice it in yourself. You learned to name it and regulate it for yourself, to be able to see it in other people and then to relate to other people out of that awareness. I mean, that's exactly what we're talking about when we talk about emotional intelligence.
Yeah, before we wrap up, I'm just curious, is there anything you were hoping to share that you two didn't get a chance to share, or any questions you thought of as we were talking that you wanted to ask?
I think I would just say this podcast is just opening the door to a life-changing way of life that starts with just getting better informed. And so we'll share some resources with you. Some that give you more about the concept and the theory, and some that are more focused on how do you practice, just things we haven't had time to get into today, because it would take hours and hours and hours.
That'd be fantastic. Jim and Trisha, you two are the best. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy lives and schedules to be with us and to just bless and share with our community. We just so appreciate the both of you. And you guys are doing really good work. I just want you to know that. And so don't grow weary in doing good. I know it's hard, it's challenging, but you're making a difference. So keep going. Yeah. And I would echo that. I've engaged a lot of your resources, book, podcast, et cetera, and have had a ton of breakthrough because of it. So it was an honor to share the space. And real quick, if people wanted to connect with you, where can they find you? Where can they learn more? I know we'll include some resources in the show notes and things of that sort, but how can people get connected with you? The main thing they can do is go to our website, theleadersjourney.us. And I would say after they've listened to all the Praxis podcasts, then they need to go check out some of our podcasts, because we talk, we literally just recorded our 100th episode. So there are 100 episodes on this topic, because this is kind of our wheelhouse. And to just go look and see the different subtopics and find what interests you and start listening. And then on the website, give us your email address and we'll keep you posted on what we're doing and various courses and other kinds of offerings that we have. Well, thanks for joining us today. Yeah. Thanks for the invitation. Our pleasure. Thank you so much. All right. We'll see you guys. Take care. Bye. Bye-bye. Thanks for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Over the next several episodes, we plan to do a deep dive into emotional intelligence, starting with the importance of self-awareness. Emotionally mature people are self-aware people. So in our next episode, we will discuss what self-awareness is, why it matters, and how you can begin to grow into it as a follower of Jesus. We hope you'll tune in, and we'll see you next time.
Praxis is recorded and produced at Crosspoint Community Church. You can find out more about the show and our church at crosspointwi.com. If you have any questions, comments, or have any suggestions for future topics, feel free to send us an email. Also, if you enjoy the show, consider leaving a review. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.